is an honor that we get to be the kickoff to the fall 2023 Peace Week. Welcome, everybody. Our theme this week is Building Peace and Partnership. My name is Tehama Lopez Bunyasi. I'm an associate professor here at the Carter School. And before we get into our own panel, I'd like to share that it's really becoming increasingly evident that sustaining peace and promoting justice requires building partnerships between different types of actors, from local to global. Such partnerships between academic institutions, policymakers, practitioners, and regional organizations increase legitimacy, adaptability, and responsiveness to societal challenges. Partnerships also increase participation and meaningful inclusion of peace-building actors with different profiles and mandates. However, partnerships are hard to achieve and are not problem-free. Through different forms of discussion, presentations, and seminars, the Fall 2023 Peace Week will explore peace partnerships, joint peace-building initiatives, and broad coalitions that open doors for innovative, effective, inclusive, and sustainable solutions, and the development of new tools essential for making breakthroughs in conflict transformation and peace process. You'll find that our panel is rightly suited for this theme. That we're really excited to talk about the work of our own doctoral students. We have Audrey Williams, Elana Sokol, and Ashton Rohmer. When I was thinking about putting this panel together, these three women just came to the forefront of my mind about, you know, who's really like thinking about the future here. What are the, the unasked questions or the underexplored themes in our field? And they really embody this. And so I'm very excited that we get to kick off with them. And I think what we should do, I'm just going to remind everybody that when you start your presentation, if you could just reintroduce yourself by name, so that in editing processes we can see that it's a nice little slice together. And after we have presentations today from our three researchers, I'm going to continue with questions for them as a panel, and then we will open up to Q&A from our audience. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to start with Audrey Williams.
Thank you so much for that really nice introduction, Tehama, and it's really nice to be here with everyone today and to be able to help kick off Peace Week. My name is Audrey Williams. I am a PhD candidate at the Carter School at the Carter School. This is the Carter School. I'm also the lab manager for the Narrative Transformation Lab. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on music and conflict transformation, and I'm going to do our Zoom ritual where I share my screen. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about using the concept of life world as well as the concept of world building to think through the relationship between music and conflict transformation. For my dissertation project, I have these two very broad overarching research questions that I've been thinking about. How does music shape conflict transformation, and how does conflict transformation shape music? And one of the sticky parts of this relationship is that it is messy, it's dynamic, it's fluid, and it is not very often linear. And so I've been kind of racking my brain how to figure out how to move through that, how to think about this relationship when it's not going to be something that's as easy as song A leads to effect B. So one thing I've been doing is thinking about life worlds. And before I go into that, I want to kind of just get us into a case that I was thinking about this past August, when the Irish protest singer Sinead O'Connor, who also went by Shahada Sadakat after converting to Islam, when she passed away. And I'm not sure how many folks on here are familiar with her work, But there was a big moment in the 90s where she was really gaining popularity with her music, and she appeared on Saturday Night Live in New York City, the sketch comedy show, where they have musical guests. So she was the musical guest in 1992, October of 1992, and she sang a cappella, and she sang a rendition of Bob Marley's War, adapted, slightly shortened rendition. And at the very end of it, she ripped up a photo of Pope John Paul II. And what this was a protest against the sexual abuse of children by members of the Catholic clergy, particularly in Ireland, where Sinead was from. And this caused quite an outrage. And so looking at that case, I started thinking, well, if we're thinking about the life world, if we're thinking about world building, and we're thinking about the fact that she took on this very political issue through music, what then might this be able to tell us about conflict transformation? So I've been thinking about the life world as a concept. It originates in a very academic formulation in the project of phenomenology. It originates with Edmund Husserl. And this concept is basically kind of the background knowledge that we draw upon, often in very subconscious ways, to make our way through life. So ideas of how should we live our lives? How do we go about relating to ourselves? How do we go about relating to others? How do we go about relating to the world around us? What resources are we drawing upon? What knowledge are we drawing upon to make sense of things? And one way to think about this is that, we all have our life worlds. They're very vibrant. They are very hard to map. They are not as neat as this circle. This is just a model, right? And then we have our horizon. So if you're, looking out into the distance, I'm in Iowa, so it's really easy to see the horizon because it's very flat, not a lot of trees. You're looking out to the distance, and beyond the horizon is beyond where your life world is. So out there is knowledge that you're not necessarily drawing upon. But the thing about a horizon is you can move towards it, and it moves with you, right? So you move towards it. Some of the world, a different part of the world opens up to you. You're not static in this space, and your life world is not static and fixed. But the other thing about the life world is that it's shared, right? You're having your own individual experience of life, and you're drawing on your own individual repertoire, again, in very subconscious ways. But you will share those repertoires with others. And this in particular was elaborated by Jürgen Habermas. He really thought through the life world in terms of communicative action. And so for him, the life world is not just this background knowledge about how you make your way through the world, but how you communicate with people. And so not just ideas of, how you go about communicating with people, but also how do you know that this is the right way to communicate with people? And so it's a very subjective space, and it's a very relational space. And so when we're thinking about life worlds, we could think about different types of overlap. And you could say that there might be a breakdown in communication when people don't share any part of their life worlds at all, which I'm not entirely sure that ever happens. I feel like we all have some overlap. But that's one way to think about it, is that people who are kind of sharing most of their life world are probably going to be able to intuitively, right, make meaning and make sense with each other in ways that are harder when you don't share that. But of course, these are neat models. Even this is a neat picture, but to get outside of these very neat Venn diagrams and get us into this space, I wanted to just show that, again, life world does not have really neat boundaries. It's very messy. It's very fluid. There are a lot of different ways where our life worlds might overlap, and then ways where, our life worlds might be different than those of the people around us. One of the difficulties with using the concept of life world is thinking about, okay, if it's so far in the background, if it's so subconscious, if it's so relational, then how do you actually use it in things like conflict transformation? How do you actually have agency, right? How do you know you're not just following scripts? And so one way I've been thinking about it is by tying it to world building. Particularly the literary concept of world building. So the idea of worldviews, worldview conflict, and world making is already In our literature, we have Jane Doherty, who is an alum of our PhD alum of our school. She talks about worldview conflicts as clashes of inner worlds, clashes of senses of reality or cognitive structures. And these worlds are not, they are subjective as well, right? They're constructed together through what she calls world making stories. Tavis also talks about world making in terms of worlds made, basically the extant world that we are navigating together, and world making, that process of reshaping that world and bringing new worlds into existence. One reason I want to add in world building, and I'm still really building this out, is because it is rooted in the arts, particularly literature. And it's this idea that as you're writing new stories, you are bringing a new world into existence, right? So that your characters can move through a world that feels fuller, and then your readers can understand that world better. And so at a very technical level, it means populating it with objects, traditions, ecologies, cultural touchstones that help the reader understand the world that the character is in and help the reader get into that world in particular. And so what I've been thinking through then by trying to tie these concepts together, and I've been calling my concept the song world, afterlife world, is to think about song world as life world, our background knowledge that music helps to make up, and music helps us to navigate the world. And then song world as a world building, when that background knowledge comes to the foreground just enough for us to then really recognize and not take for granted the knowledge that we are building our lives around, and to think, well, is that the knowledge that makes sense for me in this moment? Is that the place I want to stay in my life world, or do I see a new horizon that I want to move towards? And so what I'm saying is that music can function as a disruption in the life world that then allows you to do some world building together. And then through that world building, with others, maybe sometimes individually too, if others are not experiencing this disruption around you and you are, you kind of rebuild your world. You orient yourself towards new horizons, you move towards new horizons, and your life world changes, and then it fades back into the background, right? This in itself presents a linear process, which is not the case, but I've just been thinking around this concept to try to understand what that relationship between music and conflict transformation might be. So if we go back to the case of Sinead O'Connor, where she does something very unexpected in SNL, and she gets a lot of backlash. And what I would say here, when I was thinking through it, is to think about, well, there are a lot of different life worlds that are mixing here, a lot of different song worlds that are mixing here around Sinead O'Connor, around what's appropriate for a musical artist to do, especially at SNL, around, right, the Catholic life world. And I grew up Catholic, so I have a life world that's kind of this background knowledge about what it meant to grow up Catholic, right? And so there are all these different intersecting places. And one of those places is just what's right for a pop singer to do. And so for Sinead O'Connor herself, this event was, and I don't know if it was a disruption for her, because what she said following it, this is in her memoir, she said, "Everyone wants a pop star, see, but I am a protest singer. A lot of people say or think that tearing up the Pope's photo derailed my career. That's not how I feel about it. It wasn't derailed, it was re-railed." So for her, it is a shift, right? It's not derailing it, it's re-railing it to be closer to what she has always been trying to do. But then for others, was it a disruption, right? Did it disrupt their notions of what her music was about? Did it disrupt their notions about this conflict in particular, right? Was that disruption of violence? Did it feel like a threat? Or did it feel like an opportunity, right? And so what I'm saying basically is that we could use this concept of disruption within different song worlds. So looking at music and how it might disrupt the life world just enough to become a little bit more aware of it and think about, okay, well, how do I want to move through the world now that I have seen that SNL clip or heard that song or been together in that concert or been together in that protest where music is being used to rally us together. So I really look forward to any questions you all might have. And yeah, just thank you.
That's great. Audrey, I think that was a really elegant presentation of your theoretical foundation for your for your work here. So I really enjoyed that. Thank you. Our next presenter is Elana Sokol, and as soon as we get a new spotlight, there she is. All right. Elana, it's all yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen. I am in PDF mode because my laptop crashes when I do PowerPoint. So I am currently a PhD candidate at the Carter School. My name is Elana Sokol, and I will be presenting on smart cities. So I want to start with thinking about all the different ways we engage in this space. So thinking about technology, what is technology? So in this sense, I'm thinking about it as electronic, digital, Internet of Things, and censored applications in the way we interact with it in public spaces. So if we look at this image, we see all these different kind of labeled technologies in a city space. Some of them that we see today that are easy to spot are like tolls on roads. These are ways we interact with these technologies in an everyday sense. But there's a lot of technologies here that we don't always realize we're interacting with. So this is some of the conflict that I'm starting to look at, is how do we develop technologies in urban spaces? And how do we partner with different organizations to decide what impact it'll have on society and what best is to be placed in certain cities? And also in relation to technologies, I've been thinking about these different concepts of screens, scenes, and unseens. So screens is the first level of interaction we have with technologies. Scenes is kind of what we can see around us. So video cameras, facial recognition, biometric fingerprint data, collection areas. And then unseens is the things that we can't see. It's really hard to understand and analyze the different ways our data is being used here, especially when it's used in places like scoring systems. So there's a lot of back-end data in the cloud, this imaginary cloud that people reference. Where is it? Who knows? And this is this unseen place. How is the data being collected? How is it being governed? And how is it going to be used in the future? So thinking about this technology everywhere, I've been thinking about digital literacy. So as we engage in these digital spaces, there's no prompt that comes up that says, have you read the terms and conditions? It's assumed you've consented to whatever technology is collecting on you in a public space. So going back a couple of years, there was that really big litigation against a company called Cambridge Analytica. They got in trouble for data scraping a lot of users' data without consent. And so there was a documentary about it called The Great Hack on Netflix, if anyone has seen it. But a result of this was policy change in Europe called GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. So with that comes new ways that the US as well has to respond and say, hey, how do we interact with technologies and inform users about the ways they're engaging in this space? So especially in public places, right? I think it's very difficult to see the different ways we're engaging in this space, right? There's not a lot of signage around the ways we're consenting to this technology, engaging in our behaviors and our interactions. Also, I don't know if you guys take the time to read terms and conditions. I do sometimes, but I think there's data that says like it takes over an hour to read a terms and conditions. It takes less time to read like the US Constitution. So I don't know who sits down and reads that pretty often, but just thinking about the ways that we engage in the space, digital literacy is not one that we prioritize very often, but the more we engage in technologies, it needs to be prioritized. So now I bring us to this concept I mentioned earlier, smart cities. What is it? It's really just modern infrastructure, but that doesn't sound as sexy, right? I'm gonna go work on some modern infrastructure because it's out of date. So you have these concepts called connected communities, and they have different characterizations based on the terminology used. So I'm going to be using the term smart city for this presentation in my research. The focus here is on the service-oriented, pragmatic urban governance and techno-solutionism, usually between the private sector and the public sector, specifically in the US. Other regions also have different terms for these spaces with different values. And depending on these values, it really contributes to how they're going to develop these spaces and what they're trying to focus on for their community. So for instance, in Europe, they've been focusing a lot on sustainable cities, privacy, participation, and ecology. So really big focus on climate change, as well as with that GDPR that's currently enacted, they are more concerned about user data. And then in addition to that, you have safe cities. This is more common in regions like China, where they're interested in political order, security, and harmony. But for this presentation, we'll focus on the smart city aspect. So what you can see in this graph here, not graph, but image, is the city at the top. We engage in this kind of visual space, but as we know, below the iceberg in the conflict resolution field, there can be a lot of dynamics we don't see. And that goes back to those unseens and kind of the development of these spaces that are not as visible to the public. So the tension here that I've been studying are these dynamics between the groups developing these spaces. These relationships don't have a clear line around, agreement on how they'll develop the technologies and what they'll put where. So you can see here, it's not as clean as, a word cloud. It is a word cloud, but you can see there's these tensions, right? They're all in different places. They're not easily aligned. So these two groups, the public and the private sector, which in this case is usually a collaboration between a state entity, the public and the private, and they are there to deliver kind of this public infrastructure. So with this, you see different kinds of negotiations happening. So in the past, what we've been seeing in the business space was a lot more distributive bargaining techniques for negotiating these contracts and relationships. But what's unique in the smart city space is it's more integrative, which means they're more about open sharing of communications, long-term, relationships, and trust building. But to do this, you have these elements of the prior distributive bargaining and relationship building that are existing, so that infrastructure is not as clean cut in this new industry. So I am approaching this, starting to look at this from a competing value perspective using the narrative lens framework from Professor Simmons. So thinking about how these different groups, such as the private sector, the public sector, and even different cities and regions are, focusing on these different values. So for instance, in Arlington, I spoke to some folks here. They're really focused on inclusion. They want to include the community. They're really interested in what the community wants as they develop these technologies. Whereas some other cities I've seen, they've been really focused on defense, security, right? So they're working a lot more with like military groups. So you can start to see these in these relationships between the smart city development. And it shows kind of what technologies they're going to implement depending on these values. So it's a way to start coding this research as I'm starting to do ethnographic field notes. That's a word. So this is kind of this latent conflict, so this alignment. So in the past, cities that have failed, they've been worth billions and billions of dollars due to a misalignment of these values. They were on opposite ends, and they couldn't seem to come to the middle and find a solution. So the partnerships kind of disintegrated, the smart city was canceled, and the relationship was never, reconciled. So from a conflict perspective, you're seeing these kind of relationship value misalignments, as well as from an economic, political, and societal step, you're seeing a disintegration of trust. And then from the business perspective, which I'm also pulling from, is this model called the Drexel-Sibbitt team performance model. It shows a kind of orientation of storming and norming, which looks at kind of the development of these relationships and at which stage they might get stuck and how do you kind of reconcile that and keep collaborating in these partnerships. So these are the different ways and codes that I am approaching this research. It's not a given that the partnerships are going to be collaborative, but I think when they are in the research, it's shown there's a lot more, trust. There's a lot more community engagement, inclusion, and kind of these positive values that we'd like to see in our society. So then again, from this management's perspective, this is the explicit conflict. So this is the one that they're more likely to say out loud, we're stuck, here or here. They can't kind of get behind what are these questions they're trying to solve behind. So for instance, one of the groups that failed quite miserably, they weren't sure they never clarified their goals. So they got all the way to the end, and then they realized they never kind of fixed the goal clarification piece of it. So again, project got canceled. And it was really nasty too, right? political groups, activists, countries, they're all kind of starting to get involved in this space. There's a geopolitical piece of this as well, that's really impacting kind of the use cases of the cities. I forgot to set a timer. Am I on time? I'm good. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up.
Yeah,
Just kind of jumped right into it. Got too excited. But so from the peace and conflict resolution place that I'm coming from, there's a really big opportunity to jump in here and think about how do we, when partnerships get stuck or they're facing these difficult decisions and places of development, how can we jump in and help them kind of get back on track, realign their values, and focus more on these management processes. And I will stop there.
Elana,
And
that's
it's
great.
still a work in progress, so learning as I go.
It's great. I love the visuals are very helpful for not everybody is a tech savvy type, and so I think that the way that you're explaining this makes this very accessible to ask questions, and also on the part of you're thinking about the cutting edge. The theme here, Solon Simmons' work is very much on the cutting edge. He's advanced this, this really great theory in this work, and here you are immediately building off of it. So that's very exciting. Thank you. Our next presentation is with Ashton Rohmer.
All right, good morning. Let me just get situated here. I think I added my spotlight. Does that work for everyone? All right. So let me do the PowerPoint. Can y'all see presentation?
Yep.
Oh, terrific. All right, thank you. Well, I am thrilled to follow my two terrific colleagues with their presentations. My name is Ashton Rohmer. I'm a PhD candidate at the Carter School, and today I will be sharing my research interests at the intersection of public health, public streets, and public opinion. As an aspiring professor, I thought no better way to start a pop quiz on an early Monday morning, or excuse me, a presentation. Obviously, it's an early Monday morning because I can't speak properly. Presentation with a pop quiz, although I must note it is a rather somber topic. So the question for the pop quiz is, how many lives are lost on US roads annually? Now, I'd like to actually ask the audience if you're there. I don't know, I can't see anyone, so feel free to throw a guess in the chat. I'll let it simmer in silence for a couple of moments. I see a couple of responses coming in. 48,000, 45. Okay, wow, folks are a little bit more up with things that I maybe thought. Okay, 30,000, terrific. For those who might need a little bit of a nudge or a clue, it's roughly neck and neck with the number of people that we lose to gun violence every year. So with that, 46,000 was the estimate from the National Safety Council for 2022. It's important to note that we've been losing folks to automobiles and vehicular violence ever since they completely changed our built environment more than 100 years ago. It's also important to note that that vehicular violence disproportionately impacts people of color, low-income folks. It's one of the leading causes of death for adolescents. And so when we think about this, we can certainly understand that there's a lot of carnage that happens on our streets. I'm starting to theorize that this is actually part of a conflict system. So vehicular violence, I think, is normalized by a car culture that kind of pervades our society. And pardon the use of a rather hopefully apt visual metaphor here, but I tend to think of this like a bicycle wheel. So at the center is that big C conflict of kind of interpersonal, you might say, violence that happens on our streets, but it also connects to a lot of other structural inequalities and societal harm. So I can probably connect car culture and vehicular violence to, oh gosh, a whole host of things, whether it is public health or housing or economic opportunity and educational access. so many of the societal ills that we struggle with, I think can be kind of drawn back to how our built environment and our land use decisions have been kind of created to perpetuate the dominance of and independence on the automobile. The other reason why I think that the bicycle wheel is a telling metaphor is the cyclical nature of this conflict. It is constantly churning, and that is in part because a lot of decisions about our built environment and transportation in particular are, if not totally determined, at least heavily influenced by what people say at the local level and what kind of pressure local politicians and policymakers and officials feel from their constituents. So if you're grumpy about a bus stop, you can go to your public meeting. And I know this because I've been to so many public meetings at this point, and you can oppose it. And chances are you have a good shot at actually getting that bus stop moved or delayed or canceled entirely. And so the way that I talked about big C conflict is also in relationship with what I think of as a little c conflict of all of these local debates that are playing out in communities across the US and in many cases, you know, in cities across the world, where any change to the built environment that creates opportunities for other people to get around in something other than a car comes against fierce opposition at the local level. So this leaves me with a hunch, and I am not often able to make cultural references, but I am for once in my life up with the times. So apologies in advance for anyone that this might not kind of hit the same way with. But my hunch is that when people think about, let's say, bicycling, they tend to think of this, right? Like idyllic, maybe you have a memory of, you know, teaching your kid how to ride a bike, or you think back to a trip that you took with your friends in a national park on a nice bike path. All good, all beautiful. However, I tend to think that when 4,000-pound metal boxes enter the picture and are put kind of in conversation with bike lanes or other, you know, pedestrian infrastructure or public transit, people tend to get a little bit less, well, Dutch about it. They tend to get a little bit grumpy about having to put these things head to head and try to prioritize different modes of transportation. So I thought to myself, can I test this? And the answer is kind of. I'm going to share some results of a research project that I did where Professor Lopez Bunyasi actually helped me dig up some survey data. It is not a perfect data set by any stretch of the imagination. I'm making a lot of logic leaps, but I hope that you'll be able to at least hang with me and see some of what I'm trying to illuminate here. So this particular survey was a national survey of health attitudes, and there are about 7,000 folks that were in an internet panel, and they were given this question: do you think this policy should be a top priority, important but not a top priority, or not a priority at all? And there were two statements. One, making sure that there are safe outdoor places to walk and be physically active in communities where there aren't any, and then making sure that there are bike lanes, sidewalks for walking, and public transportation available. Now you might be saying, Ashton, these are basically the same. You know, one's talking about outdoor places and others sidewalks, you know, tomato, tomato. However, the second one had this interesting addition: so that people do not always have to rely on cars. And I thought this was a very interesting kind of contrast between the two. One was kind of silent on the issue of cars, whereas the other one had this very subtle reference to car reliance. Now, I hypothesized that there were certain groups that would actually support both of these policies with a little bit more kind of frequency than their other counterparts. So people of color, low-income folks, people who identify as women. I thought each of these would be more likely to support them based on either their kind of negative public health impacts due to cars or lack of other safe modes of transportation and mobility, such as people of color, low-income folks. Similarly, women or people who identify as women use the transportation network a little bit differently than their male counterparts. So, you know, they have shorter trips. They might not have use of the household car, so they might be more reliant on public transit, that sort of thing. And indeed, my analysis showed that these folks were more likely to support these two policies. But the finding that I was most interested in, though, is that that hunch that I had actually came to fruition. So if you recall, there were the two statements, one that was mum on cars and the other one that referenced car reliance. And then there was, would you think that this is a top priority, middle priority, or not a priority at all? 34% of respondents thought that the one that didn't reference car reliance was a top priority, whereas only 22% of respondents said that the statement that referenced car reliance was a top priority. So that's an interesting delta between those two, given that they're, at first glance, maybe saying the same thing. And then if you look at the other side of it, where it was not a priority at all, you only have 6% of respondents saying that the first statement was not a priority at all, whereas 16% of people thought it was so kind of an odd an idea that it should not be a priority at all. I found this to be a fascinating insight, and it's what is going to be motivating my dissertation research. So I will close there, but before I go, when I was coming up with emojis to put into this presentation, I was searching for no cars. And what was so interesting is that apparently we don't like 18-year-olds. I didn't know about that, but we also don't like pedestrians and don't like bicyclists, but there was no emoji that did not have a strike through the car. So as you go about your days and the week ahead, I hope that you'll keep this in mind as you look at your built environment and society around you and how car culture infiltrates in all these interesting ways. Thank you.
Ashton, thank you so much. I think in many ways you've illustrated to us just how deeply embedded cars are in our culture, how normative they are, and then to reflect on what does it mean to normalize the violence around that is probably giving a lot of people pause right now. I want to get into our panel. So I have some questions that can be, addressed by anybody on the panel. And then I have some questions that are more specific to particular presenters. So we've titled this this opening panel here, Peace Researchers at the Cutting Edge. I want to know, how do you see your research pushing our field forward?
Someone like to do that first?
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead, and maybe then when we answer questions, we can reverse the order a little bit. But I'll just say that when I came to this field, kind of concerned with issues of narrative and art, I was initially thinking of looking at literature, then I took up music. And I've actually, I think throughout this process, kind of struggled a little bit between, and especially seeing, it's so good to see my colleagues Ashton and Elana, all the great work that we're all doing, that you all are doing, and just thinking about, well, how broad is our field? What is included in our field? And sometimes it can feel like arts, maybe that that it might not be as serious as an inclusion, and I think for a lot of reasons, right? So I think one way that I've been trying to thread this is to think about, well, art is meaningful for a lot of people. A lot of people are going about their lives working with music, working with literature, watching films, right? Ashton, I am just always in awe of the way, I don't know, you sell yourself short, the way you channel pop culture. And thinking about, well, instead of kind of trying to put any part of our field on the side, really, to think about what is the place of it? What when you're thinking about really intense issues like violence and conflict, where do they show up? How do they show up? What do we need to work through? And what areas do we need to be in? And so thinking again about just the example of Sinead O'Connor, right? It wasn't, it reverberated, right? And she took on a strong issue, and she, I won't say that she paid the price for it, because for her it wasn't a price, right? But it really was a dividing line in her career. And so I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. It is Monday morning, but I think what I'm trying to do is maybe break down these ideas that art and peace, art and justice, art and conflict are either not in relationship with each other, or when they are, it's a kind of frivolous thing. And to think about what would it mean if we just take this seriously, because plenty of people do. Artists do, people who engage with art do. The US military does when they put a lot of money into Hollywood. So I think that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to speak to how you see your research kind of pushing the field in different directions?
I can go. So in the tech space, there's been a lot of talk around like artificial intelligence and data governance, and there's a lot of big tech companies currently in, Capitol Hill right now trying to hash out how world order should work in the realm of cyber, right? So I think sometimes what I feel is missing is a conflict resolution lens. There's a lot of other ways to approach the development of technologies that's not just a checkbox, like an audit, am I compliant with XYZ policy? Great. But not thinking about the impact on society, community, kind of those long-term, ripple effects it'll have as we develop, smart detection streetlights that can also do facial recognition, hear gunshots. And then you have, algorithms that have, data sets that kind of racially profile people, or you have surveillance capitalism. How is your data being monetized? Is it transparent? Are companies being held accountable? And there's all these kinds of elements of conflict resolution that are not always embedded into these discussions that I see on the Hill, that I see kind of behind the scenes in these meetings. So I'm hoping to embed myself in these kind of behind the scenes negotiations to think about how we as conflict resolution practitioners can be more involved.
Thank you. Ashton, do you want to get in on this?
Yeah, I'll take a quick turn. So to the best of my knowledge, our field hasn't yet recognized that car culture constitutes a cycle of conflict. And one in our society that I think has created a kind of rather violent epidemic. So I find this to be somewhat surprising, given the many ways that our dependence on cars locks us into a system of harm that operates at both the individual level through behavior and decisions, and at the level of systems, structures, institutions, through policy, legal jurisprudence, and most pervasively, I guess, cultural practices. For anyone that did see Barbie, there were a lot of references to cars and particularly toxic masculinity as an example. So it goes beyond the astonishing number of fatalities and injuries and all of the trauma that comes with that, to include broader public health impacts like air pollution and noise pollution, to economic impacts such as 25% of people being what's called transportation insecure and not being able to participate in the job market or access educational opportunities, to cost of environmental degradation. I mean, really the list goes on, and almost every instance disproportionately impacts low-income folks and people of color, people with disabilities, and also is throughout intricately connected to decisions we make about land use, zoning, housing, etc. So my goal is to push the field to understand these dynamics that lock most Americans into communities where a $10,000 a year investment to maintain and operate a vehicle is literally the only way to participate in society, so that we can further appreciate those negative externalities on automobile dependence, and then see all of the ways that it manifests in different aspects, ranging from, like I mentioned, toxic masculinity to the military industrial complex, and even how private interests have lobbied for less regulation over a century. You really, once you see it, you can't unsee it, and the onion has many layers. So hopefully we can start to see that this is a significant area of study, and urgent kind of attention is needed so that we can address the massive power imbalances that kind of perpetuate injustices that play out on our streets.
Thank you. Definitely the part of you see it, you can't unsee it. It has stayed with me ever since I started hearing about your research. And thinking about the overall theme of this week with the partnerships, it also makes me think about bridges. And in our school, we are interdisciplinary. So Sarah Cobb would always say we are transdisciplinary, And so I think about that as bridges, as partnerships of knowledge and scholarship and ideas. And so I'm curious as to what you think, what kind of interdisciplinary connections do you find in your own work right now as it stands?
I'm happy to mix up the order as Audrey suggested. So having just completed my comprehensive exam, I can tell you that our field is maybe one of the few that hasn't attempted to grapple with the conflict system of automobility. So I was able to draw on research from the fields as wide-ranging as public health, medicine, gender studies, sociology, geography, history, architecture, environmental policy, anthropology, it really, philosophy. There are some real existential questions here. So there's a breadth and depth of this issue that I'm fortunate other folks have really taken seriously. And I'm hoping in my own research to kind of stand on insights gleaned from psychology, communication, urban planning, and political science to hopefully contribute new insights to scholarship from the, I think, very unique perspective that peace and conflict resolution could lend.
Okay, cool. Elana.
Yeah, so I've been pulling from the business space primarily, then psychology, thinking about how, within an organization, how they come together and develop these spaces. And then secondly, also thinking about kind of the technology space, right? Cybersecurity. And that's a really big space to grapple with, how they view tech ethics and just kind of different technical things that I was less familiar with. So trying to pull that all in together. And then urban development too, Ashton, sometimes I overlap into your field. I'm like, ooh, I got to step back. Like, it's a lot. Because there's a lot of work that's really been developed there. So threading it all together has been really fun.
Thank you. And Audrey.
I think in my case, it's really kind of lucky. The interdisciplinary pathways are pretty clear when we think about the way that universities are set up. For example, right, we have arts and humanities, and so we've got English departments, we've got music schools. We have a school of music at GMU, visual arts, and all of that. So I feel like those pathways are actually quite open and quite easy to find. And I was actually just at the Peace and Justice Studies Association conference this past weekend, and there were actually a lot of panels about art. And it was really cool to see that there were folks from English departments, from literature, from music education. It was a very, very interdisciplinary group of folks. And I think maybe one of the way forwards here too is making those relationships not just stronger, but really being creative about what they look like, and not seeing kind of these strong poles where here's the arts, here's peace studies, peace and conflict studies, conflict resolution, and all that. And all we need to do is just bridge them, but to see, well, are they a lot closer? Are there a lot of places where those connections are being made in ways that are different and innovative, and that start to kind of break down again what I was talking about in terms of this hierarchy that that these disciplines, they're just kind of set up to say, okay, well, but we need to protect our boundaries. And so doing that in a way that really respects the knowledge of the different disciplines and understands that there are different things to be brought, but also understands that just because you're an artist doesn't mean you're a peace builder. That was actually a really good conversation that was had at this conference. It's kind of claiming that you can be both. And it doesn't have to mean that you are deeply trained in both to be able to say that you're in that space, while also respecting that training in either, right, is a real craft in and of itself.
Well said. So each of you now has crossed a certain threshold on the way to doctor, and so each of you has passed the comprehensive exams, which means that you're standing very much on like your own, like you're launching into dissertation, and you've had time to reflect on on the fields that you are engaging with in our own field. And so what kind of big thing is on your mind as you step forward into the next, it's really the next part of this process of becoming, you know, Dr. fill in the blank?
I can switch up the order
Yeah, that'd be
again.
good.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about the research component. It's very easy to write the literature review and have lots of big ideas. It's another to say I will gather data on this hypothesis. I am looking into ways to find this research that I think exists that's in a very private, kind of invite-only exclusive space, you know, the behind the scenes negotiations as they're developing these emerging technologies.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to think about ways to, you know, make those connections, get involved, and, you know, discover what's kind of less obvious in other, you know, parts of society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ashton, you want to go?
Sure. So I am going to be looking at two different dynamics in my research. The first is how what's called the principal implementation gap kind of exists when applying it to hyper-local transportation issues. So I suspect, for example, that white liberals say that they believe in values such as equity and sustainability and public safety, but that they might exhibit lower levels of support for policies that uphold those values. So I'm in the process of generating a series of policies that I could actually use to test in an experimental setting, the extent to which that gap exists, and then also trying to figure out if there are different frames that I can use that might actually reduce that gap. So I'm working on crafting vignettes that frame the issue in slightly different ways, and we'll hopefully get a sense of whether or not, you know, looking at it from a violence perspective or a peace perspective, for instance, has an impact on how supportive folks are for how they're seeing transportation decisions made at the local level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Audrey?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in this space where methodology is top of mind, and how am I going to go about looking at this relationship? And I think thinking about life world and world building, I'm really excited to kind of dive deeper into it. And also it can feel very daunting as well, right? It brings to mind very really colonial ideas of, well, let's map the space and claim territory and things like that. So trying not to fall into that, while also thinking about how do I look at my particular case. And right now I'm thinking to look at a Muslim punk rock band from the United States. How do I you know, work with that case, work with the people involved, whether the people making music or the people who are listening to the music, including myself. I listen to the music in a way that doesn't kind of try to stultify it and solidify it into these, well, this is what that life world is forever and always. And we can see it, and then we can work with it and manipulate it, and then we'll do something for peace or do something for justice, and kind of try to pull back out of those frames and be a lot more creative about that, and also think about the relationality in that as well.
Okay. I have one last question kind of for everyone, and then I have just a couple more specific things before we open the Q&A. So it's very clear to me in your presentations that the theoretical premises that you're laying down are like fascinating, like very engaging. It's you're reaching well beyond our field into others, which is exciting. And I love theory. I mean, theory to me is like kind of lifeblood of my own scholarship. In our school, we also have a really big emphasis on practice and implementation. And so I'm curious as to how you see, you know, the possibilities of connecting to practice or translating your work towards some measure of impact. Have you given some time to think about that?
You can switch it up again and kind of get back to that space. what I would really love to do and really move towards is again thinking back to the craft of music and the craft of peace, and where those two intersect and can be the same thing too, again, to kind of like break that down a little bit,
Mhm.
at a technical level and at a relational level. And what that would basically look like is applied arts projects as integrated into applied peace or applied justice projects. And there are a lot of examples out there. One that just kind of comes up in the literature time and time again is the East-West Divan Orchestra, which are around building relationships between Palestinian musicians and Israeli musicians. So there are a lot of these out there, but also thinking about, again, not falling into this instrumental idea. And so for me, I mean, I would love to, I am someone who has an arts background. I'm kind of re-engaging with that through this project, which has been really, really nice. And so, you know, what would a study like this be able to allow to surface in terms of what musicians think is happening in the relationship between music and conflict transformation, in terms of what people who are listening to it think, and then how might that then kind of help people just do music and peace, music and justice projects differently, right? Even, you know, what does better mean? I'm sure there are areas where you can do it better than others, but really just how do you do it differently? How do you just add more to your craft repertoire and can keep that sense of play and imagination together?
Okay, thank you. How about Ashton?
Yeah, so I have to come clean. I am able to evangelize because I am someone who relies on public transit, biking, walking for all of my transportation needs, because I'm lucky enough to live in a community where that's possible. And so one of the things that I, see as I go out and about and look at how our built environment and cultural practices and policy prescriptions kind of play out is I'm personally impacted by these power imbalances that have shaped our built environment, that kind of prioritize speed and storage of cars rather than the safety. And I would even go so far as to say joy of, because why not, of all road users. And so in my spare time, I advocate for the changes I hope to see in my community. And technically, I'm also a hyperlocal, nonpartisan, volunteer, part-time elected official. And so try to get at this in a lot of different ways. I've had countless conversations that mirror the exact conundrum that my research seeks to address. And I know that other advocates face the same frustration in talking with people that they think would be, totally down with the cause of like, yeah, I don't want to have kids not be able to get to school because, by any other route than driving. But yet, there's that very heavy cultural kind of layer that is hard to break through, given all the things that cars symbolize and unlock in our society. So I do hope that my research can do is highlight the importance of looking at it from a wide range of topic areas. So for instance, we see that if we only focus on climate change, we still hang on to a lot of other negative externalities of cars. So EVs, for example, are heavier than their internal combustion engine cousins. And with that heft comes faster degradation of tires, which in turn produces more particulate matter pollution. And so if we have our policymakers that are only focusing on climate change, or only focusing on, equity, or only focusing on these single issues, then we lose the ability to see the much broader and holistic picture of how these things come to pass. So I'm hoping that both advocates and policymakers can get a better handle on how to talk about these things, because I bet I made at least one person uncomfortable today. And the fact that it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about, I think means that it's a great thing to talk about. And yet one thing that we aren't prepared to talk about. So in addition to sex, religion, and money, I think we should add car culture to the list of things that we've both been, kind of indoctrinated into not talking about, but also that we really should be prepared to have more nuanced conversations.
Well, thanks. And part of that practice, that bike behind you is not a plant for this presentation, is it? This is just part of your life. Okay, yeah.
No, it's yeah, sorry.
Staying true to self. Elana, how do you see your work connecting to practice?
Yeah, so I've seen quite a trend of this private sector developing digital diplomacy positions, in the public sector creating specific departments that are called like the smart city department, and trying to dig into kind of what are they doing and how are they developing these spaces. In addition to this, with those development of positions in their own sector, there's these big conferences happening where like 60 or 70 cities say, hey, we want a smart city, thinking it's like some easy thing to check off on a box. But I think some of the research that I'm starting to find is that really is quite a unique process. It shouldn't be a copy paste cookie cutter city. There's so many unique aspects of every community and every relationship that technology has with these different groups. So I think there's some element of advisory work that needs to take place based on this research that's maybe not being conducted at the level of a conflict resolution practitioner, where we have the theories and the background and the knowledge of the different ways society's impacted, with our different, lenses and frameworks that we use to do this analysis work. So I think kind of taking out the transactional business piece of it and bringing in the more human element and the ethical element that we bring to our work is going to be really kind of prevalent going forward, especially before we put down our roots in the infrastructure and kind of take a step back and say, what are we actually accomplishing here with these development of smart cities and relationship building?
Okay, thank you. So I'm looking at the time. We have 20 minutes left for our session. If you could quickly, briefly respond to one question each, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. I think that would be great. There's just a couple more things for, given the particularity of your research. Elana, if I'd like to start with you. So what emerging technologies excite and frighten you at this moment?
So in the public sector, I'm really excited for the development of more signage, more kind of transparency and accountability around the different ways technology is being used. There's a group I've been tracking that really do a great job of open sourcing kind of, what technologies are in this place and how the data is being used. And it's a really big collective project with the community and the different sectors. The thing that really frightens me is the private sector is faster at developing technologies with less accountability. I was just at Whole Foods the other week and I saw a palm to pay option. You put your palm down with biometrics and you pay. And I know when you do self-checkout, you consent to they scan your face because they want to make sure you're not taking, produce or food, without paying, and they weight your, basket to purchase bags section. There's a lot of data gathering. But I was thinking if I were to click the terms and conditions on the palm to pay reader, everyone in line is going to really hate me. There's 20 people lining up, right? Who is the time to do that? But I really worry about the private sector kind of getting very fast at developing technologies before the public sector has a way to kind of not govern it, but kind of look at ways to have accountability and kind of digital literacy opportunities for the society. And then here's a screenshot of what that, if I can pull the palm to pay thing in.
I'm frightened now too.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly share it because it's kind of wild. But this is the palm to pay option at Whole Foods now. And there's a little terms and conditions on the bottom right corner if you can see it. But there's no way the 20 people in line wanted me to click that and read it.
Wow. And you said this is Whole Foods?
Yeah, it's the one in Clarendon.
Just connected to Amazon, correct?
Yeah, that's the one.
That's right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Audrey, I have a question for you. What are some recurring issues that you've seen come up around the study and implementation of music-based peace work?
I think one of the biggest ones and one of the hardest ones to just grapple with is this notion of causality or this notion of impact. How can you measure the impact of music? And I think that there are two issues here. One is simply that music and the arts are still considered to be very soft areas of the field.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact that political cartoons can be very divisive and used in ways that are very violent. Music can literally be used as a weapon of torture, as has been done, for example, in the so-called War on Terror by the US government. And so that's one of them, is that there's this sense of, if we're doing arts-based projects, if we're doing music-based projects, there's not necessarily any need for rigor there because it's just art.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have high stakes the way that like a peace dialogue would have high stakes, for example. And so that idea. And then the other just being too that we're uncomfortable, I think, in a lot of areas. Some folks might be less uncomfortable than others, but especially in the academy, we're uncomfortable with maybe not being able to say for sure what has happened, what the dynamics are. And really I've been thinking about this recently, that there might be shifts, right, in a life world, for example. And you might just not really know for sure what that shift was. You might not be able to pinpoint it and say that thing happened because of this thing. And are we going to be able to be comfortable with that, knowing that there are shifts happening and knowing that we should take it seriously and still do the best we can, and maintain that creativity? I think that's probably the biggest one. It's definitely the biggest one I'm grappling with as, you're doing a dissertation project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then lastly, Ashton, you've definitely brought up, we see violence now in a different way possibly than we did before this presentation. Are there opportunities for peace building when it comes to? Okay, great. Let's hear about
it. Thankfully, yes. No, do not despair, everyone. We're not doomed. So first, if you want a vision of what our possible future could look like, if you are lucky enough to ever go to the Netherlands, go there, and you can see what a different future might be. But so Barbie got it right, in other words. So one of the things though that initially drew me to this space was the concept of tactical urbanism. It's I'm an urban planner by training, and so think a lot about, obviously, our built environment. Tactical urbanism is this idea where regular people use low-cost, temporary tools and materials, I guess, to enact changes in their built environment. So you might have people put up cones on the ground where they need a bike lane. There have even been human bike lanes created to protect cyclers. Or people might install wayfinding signage. So maybe Elana, some folks can put up that smart city signage that you wanted on their own. Obviously, government should do that, and private sector should do that. But there are many times when they're slow to act, or they're reluctant to act, or maybe someone gets some friends together and paints a crosswalk when municipalities haven't been responsive to community requests for better pedestrian infrastructure. So there are ways that people kind of take it into their own hands, for better or worse. Now, there's certainly some concerns about this in terms of community engagement and that sort of thing, but I think what it does is it indicates that there's a latent need that hasn't really been addressed from a very kind of low-hanging fruit safety perspective. Perhaps one of the most well-known instances of tactical urbanism is when someone pays for a parking spot and then repurposes it for any manner of uses, whether it's seating, you can put plants, you can have a cornhole game set up. So this rather subversive tactic has actually kind of gained popularity in mainstream circles and turned into an annual tradition. I think it might be worldwide, but at least in the US, it's either last week or sometime in September, I think they do it. It's called Parking Day. And so I think that's a really neat kind of illustration of how people can show the government in very creative ways how they might want to shift how we think about our transportation system. Other peace building opportunities I've come across, one I loved was an instance of a bicycling collective for folks who identify as women that's challenging narratives of gentrification and displacement in Los Angeles. And then, of course, I'd actually be remiss if I didn't mention bike buses. So in communities across the country, there are parents and community members that are getting together and creating routes in their community so that they can pick up the kiddos along the way. And I dare you to watch one of these YouTube videos of this action and not have a giant smile on your face, because there is perhaps nothing more heartwarming than seeing 100 kids on bikes of, from 5 to 15, on their little bike buses. And so that's I'm very curious to see how that movement kind of sparks larger conversations about how kids get to school, how our built environment is often not made with kids in mind or involving kids in the community engagement process. And so those are some things that I see as exciting opportunities for peace building in this space.
Thank you. Hope abounds. We have 12 minutes left, and we have 25 people who are in the audience. And this wonderful morning, so I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I think the best way to do that is in the chat. So if you have a question that you'd like to pose to a specific person or to the entire panel, please go ahead and put that in the chat. In the meantime, In the meantime, I'd like to ask, I'll keep my eye on the chat. This is a building partnerships week, and for Peace Week. And so is there anybody that you're interested in building a partnership with and collaborating with, or you just want to kind of like open the doors to like communicating with other people about your work and hearing about theirs?
I can go first. But yeah, so I'm starting the research phase of my research discovery phase, right? What research do I need to start collecting? And I think, I don't want to speak for the others, but I feel like we're probably all in the same boat. But if anyone knows of people developing smart cities or emerging technologies, I would love to interview them at a later stage. So feel free to share that information, or if you are one of those people, reach out. Because that is kind of going to be very important to my later stage of my research.
Okay. Anybody briefly respond to that, collaborators?
I'll do a little bit of a shameless plug. I have a blog called peaceandplanning.com, and that's where I'm trying to cultivate a habit of public scholarship. And so if folks want to learn more about this issue and topic, head over there. But I'm also eager to hear from folks that are in practice, whether it's policymakers or activist spaces. I hope to implement an experiment, and so I'm not at this point. I'm hoping that it'll all work out, so I don't have to go begging people to take it on a one-by-one basis. But if there are folks that are interested in collaborating on the research front and gathering insights or contributing to survey design or partnering on how best to make the research and data that I gather more useful to more folks, I would definitely welcome that kind of collaboration.
Okay, thank you. And Audrey, we have one question in the chat, but go ahead and if you want to take this question.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think the best way I could say this is that, again, I'm the lab manager of the Narrative Transformation Lab. And so if any folks are interested, that would be a really good way to kind of reach out. Obviously any sort of applied projects that could be affiliated with the lab or not, right? Any sort of arts-based projects, if anyone's interested in those or already doing those, I'd love to hear from you. And then the other thing too is I'm just like trying to think about, again, methodologically, how to kind of go about this. And so I'd love to just like chat about music with people. So if any of you are musicians or just like love listening to music and like want to jam about it sometime and just think about it together in ways that like, would receive appropriate credit and things like that. I'm trying to think that through, but I'm just trying to get my head around it and be great to do that with other people.
Thank you. All right, so I'm looking at the chat. We have a question. Is on a world stage with the areas that you're working on, how do you think different divisions of the United Nations can help?
I'm happy to take a very kind of broad turn on this. So interestingly, the extent of vehicular violence worldwide prompted the UN to commit to slitting in half the approximately 1.3 million annual roadway deaths by 2020. And it's important to note that low-income countries are way disproportionately likely to have higher instances of vehicular violence. And so it was great to see the UN take that stand. I don't think that they've met that goal, and I didn't get a great sense of how they were actively trying to kind of participate in that process. But one thing that I think is important is that a lot of countries, we think that technology is going to save us. And I think Elana has shed light on how that is not the case. We have the technology and we've had it for hundreds of years, and it's thinking about land use and density differently, and supporting human powered transportation. There are a lot of great kind of innovative approaches, collectives and women who are making demands of their public transit systems to have women-only cars until we can live in a society where you don't have to face harassment every time you get out into the world. And so I think there's a lot of incredible thinking going on in places outside of the US. And I think that to the extent that the UN can hold up those practices and not be so constrained by, the so-called engineering best practices that have come out of countries like the US, which are in many cases the reason why we're in this mess to begin with.
Thank you. Question about how the UN can help. Elana or Audrey?
I'll just say that's a big question, Nick, and it's got me. It's a lot to chew on. I'm really that word about division. I think it just brings to mind again to me this idea that how are we separating out things? What use is it to separate out things, right? We've got a lot of different UN bodies. Where do different things, what buckets do they fall in? But also by kind of really separating those out and saying, okay, you've got, the UN's cultural body, you have the UN's, there's a reason why we have the IAEA, for example, the Atomic Energy Agency, but also does that kind of keep us from thinking about things in really different ways? So, I mean, anyway, that's what your question brings to mind for me, because it's a really big one.
Elana?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I think about kind of Sol and Simmons' root narratives a bit. So tracking which countries use which terms is like a soft geopolitical power that I'm noticing in the connected community space. They almost try to keep it neutral, like let's modernize our infrastructure, because they use the term smart city is so heavily affiliated with the US values versus, sustainable city with Europe, and they don't want to have favoritism. I haven't personally tracked all the different usages of the term, but I do know the UN Habitat group does a lot of reports on smart cities as it impacts, migration and housing and all these different kinds of ways that we're trying to implement technology to make it more efficient and have all these sensors to look at also migration of people and different needs and use cases. So I know there's groups doing it. I haven't had the opportunity to quite delve into it yet, but I'm sure there'll be opportunity for that the next Peace Week session.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So we have 5 minutes. There's one more question I think is like kind of a nice one to address towards the end. It feels a little full circle-ish. So here you are on the precipice of like really getting your dissertations underway. But we have another question that comes from, is there any advice on prospective students towards the doctoral program at the Carter School? Like anything that you'd like to share as we close out?
I would say my big thing would be there's going to be a lot of different strategic parts of any PhD application process, but really honor your gut in terms of what interests you, what kind of, hopefully not keeps you awake at night in a really bad way, though obviously that happens a lot, but maybe also just kind of gets you up in the morning, right? What are some of these big questions that just burn for you? And try to kind of keep that forward, not just because you're trying to be successful and get a PhD, and at the Carter School, for example, we have all these different issue areas. So you could look at, different professors, you could reach out personally also, right? I'd be happy to chat. But also think about, well, there's a reason that you want to be here. And that reason, that passion you have, that burning question you have is going to get you through and be the best contribution you can make to the field. So basically don't box yourself in ways that, with ideas of, well, I need to do this in order to get this thing, because that's not how you push the field forward. So
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'll quickly jump in. I think it's similar to like an accordion, right? You have this topic that you really want to hyper focus in on, but then you have to like expand it and go in and out. And like you'll get to your end result, but it has to be something that by the end of like, let's say 4, 5, 6 years, you're still passionate about. You're not doing it just because it's, this robotic, like, oh, I should answer X question to get to Y. Like it has to be something you truly are like, in 6, 7 years, I still am interested about this. And I feel motivated and passionate to kind of on my weekends do this kind of research or meet with colleagues. So I think there's a level of like intrinsic motivation you need to have to pursue it. Not only just to answer these big questions, but a genuine interest in it.
Thank you. Ashton, last word on this?
Yeah, be kind to yourself. When you're considering a PhD, that is the first step to imposter syndrome, because we all, I think, at some point or another have felt like we don't belong here, or that we aren't smart enough, or that we aren't looking at it correctly. But everyone goes through that. And so if you at all feel like maybe it's not for you, maybe just set that feeling aside for the moment and determine what's causing that feeling, and know that it's something that you'll probably have to grapple with for the rest of your career if this is where you head. But just giving yourself some grace, that and knowing that even though it's a, kind of, it can be thought of as a lonely road, but there are a lot of other people who are going through that lonely road as well. And so to the extent that you can lean on other folks to help you through, recognizing that you are contributing important insights to the fields, and kind of echoing what both Elana and Audrey shared, we need folks to be pushing these growing edges. So trust and grace.
Well, thank you. We have come full circle on this. We have 3 shining examples of the cutting edge of our field and moving into other fields. And you're I think already inspiring questions and ideas for projects in the audience right now. I want to thank each of our presentation folks here. We've got Audrey Williams, Elana Sokol, and Ashton Rohmer. Please reach out if you want to collaborate with them, if you want to ask questions of them. They are ready to engage. Everyone, thank you so much for attending. The next panel starts at 10:30. It is called Contact Theory, Lessons Learned from Peacebuilding and Conflict Resolution. And I think it'll be great. Everyone, thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day. Have a great week.
Thanks to folks for joining in the chat.
Thank you.